Greco-Roman, idealist architecture. So the Mediterranean world entered Finland in the 17th and 18th century quite strongly, and in fact the neoclassical language was the first consciously applied architectural language in Finland throughout the country. So there was an immediate and strong connection with the Mediterranean culture. Some years back, quite a long time, I think in 1998, I happened to see an exhibition of Nordic painting at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries at Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, and I had never realized how close the Nordic countries are to each other before I saw this exhibition. All the paintings had the same kind of melancholic, low light, lonely people surrounded by nature. It was almost a shock to me to realize my own Nordic identity in the middle of Madrid and the Mediterranean world. The lower one is, of course, the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, probably the finest painter from the Nordic countries ever. In the 1920s, there was an interesting stylistic orientation in the Nordic countries, which in retrospect has been called Nordic Classicism. And it idealized the classical language, particularly the architectura minore in northern Italy. These are sketches by two very fine Finnish architects from the 1920s. This another measured drawing from mid-1920s, I think. And then two examples of architecture in that style. The left-hand side image is Alvar Aalto, young Alvar Aalto, the Workers' Union. At that age, at 27, in 1925, Aalto was so impressed by Mediterranean culture that he announced or made it clear that he wanted to turn his little hometown in central Finland into the Florence of the North. And this is one of his attempts as a young man. The other one is a church in Helsinki. So I'm just showing a few images to show you how the Mediterranean ideals seep into Finnish architectural thinking. Alvar Aalto's sketch in Greece. There is an interesting geographic move. The first Mediterranean influence was from Greece in the 19th century. Then came Italy. Then about 30 years ago, Spain, and now Lisbon. Portugal is the country that Finnish architects admire perhaps most. So there's a move from east to west. Another sketch by Alvar Aalto from San Gimignano from 1948, which shows that his interest moved away from the classical ideals. And then somewhat later in 1951, he made a trip in Spain and drew mostly of country houses, particularly this one, which is drawn just 1 year before he started to sketch his own summer house, shows that his summer house really, the ideas come from Spain, again Mediterranean world, but this time from farm vernacular, not classical language. Aalto sketches of rather insignificant things, beautiful sketches. Then also Aalto visited Morocco, and it made a strong impression on him. Some of his finest work in the late 50s has a strong Moroccan influence, as did the Moroccan architecture had an influence on Jörn Utzon and Sverre Theen equally. Alvar Aalto's sketch from the Nile River, but then I end up by arguing that regardless of the Mediterranean and southern influence and southern ideals, Finnish architecture has always had a double layering. It is architecture of the forest. We are forest people. Aalto himself once wrote that we northern people, and particularly Finns, are prone to forest dreaming. These are two examples of forest dreaming. This is another tension between, tradition, classical inheritage and modernity, but also the classical language and the geometry of forest. I'll stop here. I just wanted to somehow shortly show to you some examples of how the Mediterranean world has lived in our architecture. I can say myself, being of a different generation than these examples, but maybe I'll save it a bit later, what my influences were. Please, Álvaro.
I think there's one more.
Well, this is just a couple of small things. One of my own projects on the left-hand side, an industrial housing system, which are forest architecture, hiding buildings in the forest rather than revealing them.
Okay, how do I pass this? So I think that perhaps the first architecture aujourd'hui on Alvar Aalto could be a starting point for arguing how these references.
In a way, I became architect, and in that I owe much to Alvar Aalto, or to meeting this magazine of Alvar Aalto, because I had no interest for architecture. And the first time, because I had not relations with architects, family, no relation, so I wanted to be sculptor. And the first time I had some interest in architecture was visiting Barcelona, visiting Gaudí. Because at home, when I looked at the photos, my father in holidays, family holidays, would see, we are going to see this and this. And I looked and said, this is sculpture, fantastic sculpture. And so I saw in Barcelona almost everything I could. This was before entering the school even. And when I entered in an apartment in Casa Milá, that impressed me so much, I noticed that the interiors were made with everything I had in my house. The plinths, the knocks, the windows in wood, everything was the same, slightly different. But the big difference was that everything was sinking as in a coil together. Then, again, architecture, not interested. The first correction I had in school by a great architect and director of school was Carlos Ramos. He looked, as usually, he took paper and tobacco, made looking to the drawing, making cigarettes, then with a small soda,
Caesar.
And then he spoke. And what did he say to me? He said, it's very clear that you know nothing about architecture. So I don't speak about your drawings. I give you advice, go to a bookshop and buy some magazines about modern architecture, contemporary architecture. And I went, and I was lucky, because there were 3 architectures d'aujourd'hui. Practically was the only magazine arriving to Portugal. I'm speaking of architecture. I'm speaking of 49. Short after became Italians, cinema, neorealism, English, program of schools, France, and so on. But at that moment, architecture should be. And one was Aalto, one was Gropius, one was Neutra. Gropius, Carlos Ramos spoke many times. He was a Bauhausian, so I knew something. Neutra, I had seen some beautiful photos in Los Angeles. And Aalto, I knew nothing. It was a big surprise and like an interior explosion when I opened it. And what impressed me more, I remember, was MIT. And the exhibition, Expo 39 in New York, that interior you showed. So I had never seen something like that. And I remember I arrived to school and showed my colleagues that knew much more than me, because some were son of an architect or knew some architect or so, and they didn't like. And I had a trauma, because as I was so ignorant, I thought, I like this, but probably it's not good. Later I understood that it had me impressed so strongly, because I knew nothing of architecture. So it came suddenly a new thing, where my colleagues already know very well some Corbusier and French architecture, Italian architecture. I was an ignorant, so it came in the good moment, and then I could visit Finland, Helsinki, and see direct, and even I had a meeting with other students. I was professor then already, with Alvar Aalto. And what I noticed was how you'd take everything, not only South. He was a little architect Picasso, like Picasso. Everything you'd see and feel, and you know well, not only see, but the feelings and the touch and everything, you'd use it. So as used a lot of impressions and also things coming from his racines, he never made a copy. A copy makes one that knows only one, is fixed in one, makes a copy. But someone that has this adventure mind and attention to everything, one that lives in constant change, never makes a copy. It makes something that comes for all that tradition, innovation, other countries and so. And in fact, when I visited, and I could be in the holiday house of Aalto, in the beautiful patio, and with the anxiety for experiment with materials, that way to put small things like an animal, the form of an animal. You showed a drawing of an animal, sketch. So the nature, the human body, he made a lot of furniture. The body was present in all the things he would design. And so this was immediately in the beginning of the 50s, the influence of Alvar Aalto was everywhere, but very important in Spain and in Portugal, very, very important. And you take ideas from what you saw in the south, and you'd leave the ways for people of south, or a part, a component of the ways. And to Portugal, there was a reason for approach very, very, very near. Because in that time, after the war, even toward the war, Finland in the north, Portugal in the south. But there was a common thing. Both countries were still then, in that time, considered periphery. In such a good world, still was periphery in the small Europe. And both had, by different reasons, the presence of handicraft work very alive, naturally. I read that Finland had difficulties in getting cement and other materials, so they used much the wood and the brick, and also they had the attraction, Aalto, no doubt, for the quality of execution of the handicrafts. So we used that. But that was not a traditional way of thinking. At the same time, he was working in reconstruction, in housing, speaking of prefabrication, speaking of a medium between barak and the housing in mass. So he paid attention to everything. When it was necessary, social housing, he did it with same engagement that could be make a precious building, museum or so, no? Did not choose according the type of building or architecture at all. So he became very, very influent in Portugal, without doubt, and in the schools. So I get more confident, because I said myself, in the end, I was not wrong when I had a talk with Alvar Aalto.
So this love and this surprise and this discovery of Alvar Aalto, as we can see, was very, very important. And we know that in Spain he was received and making lots of connections, and perhaps this allowed Alvar Aalto also to visit North Africa. And I would like to ask you if you think, Juhani Pallasmaa, that the classical reference the importance of this reference in Nordic countries, let's say, and in Finland is very specific. I think it's a Nordic. It's a classicism, quite organic. For instance, when I realize this organization, how these construction, these volumes are let's say, mixed with the topos, with the place, with the topography, we can see an animal, but also if we have, let's say, a reference to classic, this is in a way the Acropolis, you know, it's a classic with no symmetry and with a strong connection with topography. And I think this was a very important target or aim or inspiration for Portugal, the way to connect and to don't make such artificial architecture, I would say. And it's very, let's say, amazing to realize that Álvaro Siza, so he had a Neutra, a Gropius, and a Aalto. And in a way, he chose the architectology of Aalto. Because in a way, Gropius, it's the opposite, in the sense that the architecture is something finito, much more French, I would say, and with not this organic connection with nature. Do you want to, please,
yes,
work this idea of the relation with the site, with the pre-existence, with the topography between
yes.
Finland and Portugal?
Let me first come back to an interesting thing when Álvaro says that he didn't want to become an architect. I didn't either. I wanted to be a surgeon.
A surgeon?
All my school years I read biographies and autobiographies of famous surgeons around the world. But when the day came to enter a university, I don't know why I walked into the architecture school. I do not know what happened.
And consciously, maybe you had also, without taking consent, looked to Alvar Aalto.
I didn't know Alvar Aalto's work so well at that time in the 57, but I would say that in retrospect I have realized that I didn't go so far from the original target, because the doctor, medical doctor, and the architect both try to improve the human condition. And in both crafts, the hand, particularly in the surgeon's work, it's very important. I just wanted to make that comment that we have come to architecture around the corner, as it were. Well,
That's why we have the eyes of the skin, because of surgery.
Perhaps,
in a way.
yes. But as I said earlier, in all creative work, if it wants to, be meaningful, one needs to combine opposites. This is the point that Alvar Aalto also made very strongly in his inaugural lecture as the member of the Finnish Academy. And he says that in architecture you have to combine tens and hundreds and thousands of contradictory requirements. That's the real essence of architectural work. That's why I have become myself somewhat suspicious of architectural theory. Architecture is such an impure and complex thing that it's almost like speaking of architectural theory is almost like speaking of theory of life. It's equally difficult and equally meaningless also. And I think that was the message of Aalto also, although he was very rationally minded, particularly as a young man. And his idea was the combination of rationality and emotional approach, intuitive approach, when he spoke and wrote about expanded rationalism. And he his message was the same as Richard Neutra's, that we need to expand rationalist method into the fields of psychology and emotion. And that's, I think, what they did. I think this is a very good example where the main part is a Pompeian atrium house. It's an archetype, Mediterranean archetype, on which Aalto himself wrote as a young man. But then it changes into something else. The opposite comes, the irregular rhythms of the topology of the forest as opposed to geometry of the city are mixed. And this, I think, is characteristic to Aalto, is combining several methods, several formal languages, several references all the time, and that is where the richness comes from when ordinary modernist work usually is too flat, has only one reference, or one level of logic. Aalto clearly is a man of the Nordic forest, and it's remarkable that the New York pavilion, which I showed and you mentioned, which often is mentioned as an example of modern Baroque. It has nothing to do with Baroque. It is forest. Aalto's code name in the competition was Aurora Borealis. Yes, and the shape is Aurora Borealis, which is the most sublime thing the human eye can see. You don't believe, but the truth is that Aurora Borealis can be 350 kilometers tall. And that's quite remarkable that one can take a metaphor from a light phenomenon or a celestial electric phenomenon and bring it into and produce fantastic, architectural imagery out of that. That's one of the capacities of Aalto, was to take a metaphor out of, a completely different context and then work it into an architectural theme. And I think in your work, I see the same, application of ideas that are not, strictly architectural always. They turn into strict architecture, but they might not be that in the very beginning.
And that's why we love so much his work. I wish we choose also this image, which is very beautiful, I think, from the house in Muram.
Can I say something?
Oh yes, of course. You prefer this or the it's okay, this image, or you prefer
no,
the...
we are in Pallasmaa.
Yes.
Something that
Eyes.
I thought to say is that when I saw the sketches, he had to use the sketch as he had that capacity of look to everything or consider everything, the complexity of architecture, where a number of conditions or needs exist that cannot be selected to put out everything. And the sketch is fantastic to make almost at the same time different solutions for different things. Those emaranhado, I don't know how to say those.
Laura?
No, I can explain. In the sketches with many lines that he makes, is that at the same time is with the hand making this, is with his mind putting different things he realizes that are needed for the solution. And then in the end, through this quickness of sketch, he can arrive gradually to the right solution that includes everything that is important, or everything that is suggested by one particular work. But the other thing I wanted to say, remembering, I read your book, The Eyes of the Skin, and I heard sometimes people or critics saying that the reference to me is Alvar Aalto. And of course it is Alvar Aalto, but in the middle of hundreds, thousands. If I learn something with architecture of Alvar Aalto and his thinking, I could not fix in Alvar Aalto. And I think it didn't happen. And in your book, I noticed that in a moment you speak of Corbusier. And in what you write, you put out this simplistic thing that sometimes arrives, that Corbusier was the systematic, the geometry, and so, and Alvar Aalto another thing, and I don't know another thing. And about Corbusier, you notice that he also made paintings, sculpture, and the head, and that is in parallel in a way with Aalto, enormous influence of another Picasso. Everything you would see in Brazil, in Japan, and so on, you would take immediately. And there is I saw, I don't know where, a sketch made by Corbusier in North Africa. And you look, you see Ronchin. So the towers of Ronchin, ventilation towers. So architecture obliges to that globality, cannot stay with tradition, cannot put out tradition, cannot stay with technique, new materials, and so is everything put together. And through history, all the suggestions that we can have, a big turn in architecture in Europe, in the world, India, I think was when Louis Kahn began going to Orient, and Corbusier also. And that had an enormous impulse. So one of the big lessons of Alvar Aalto is that capacity to get everything, and not to put it as an illustration of knowledge. One thing is that the building in America, that building,
MIT.
you arrive late there, you see, and you see, this is an American building. Of course, because he works in America with different works from those in Finland, different uses, and so on, and he takes it and makes his thing. So.
And you, in Brazil, you made Iberê Camargo, in Porto Alegre, and you are in Brazil.
But
and in Korea, you made Mimesis.
Yeah, I make what I can do.
No.
But I'm speaking of another level, you know. I'm speaking of Corbusier, Alvar Aalto, Ms. van der Rohe, very different. And these people, really, the great lesson they give is the capacity to take from a history, take from his geography, and everything. Okay. Oh, I'm speaking too much. I'm sorry.
No. I just don't speak. Well, come on.
I admire myself, Le Corbusier. When I began architecture, he was the number one for a number of years. And then again I have come back to Le Corbusier, and also Louis Kahn, who was born 100 kilometers from where I was born. It's not usually remembered that he's on the island of Saaremaa in Estonia. He's almost a neighbor. No,
your neighbor,
yes.
your cousin.
Yes. When I visited Dhaka, his parliament in Bangladesh, the first time, I had a very strong feeling that I have seen this before. And then I connected with the Karnak temple in Luxor. Both buildings have such a huge power on you that you almost fall off your feet because the power is so strong. And when I got back from Bangladesh, I looked at Louis Kahn's sketchbooks. Yes, he had visited Luxor just before he started to work on Bangladesh. So you can usually find the origins of an idea, and the same happens when I was in Japan at Katsura Palace. I felt a strange familiarity with Alvar Aalto's Villa Mairea. And when I came back to Finland, I started to study. Yes, one of his closest friends was at that time was the Japanese ambassador in Finland. He had about 12 books on Japanese architecture. And besides, more importantly, the Ethnographic Museum in Stockholm had built a Japanese tea house in the summer of 1935, when Asplund and Aalto both write very enthusiastic reports on Japanese aesthetics. So when you can feel that source, and then with a little bit effort you can show that this is the case. And I'm not saying this at all in a negative sense. On the contrary, this is the fantastic possibility in the creative world, is to learn from all directions. And I think the great ones learn from all possible sources. And I often tell my students around the world that be careful whom you choose as your mentor. You don't have to choose one of your teachers. You don't even have to choose your mentor among the living. You can choose, Brunelleschi as your mentor if you like, or Michelangelo. And this is the fantastic world of art. Everything is simultaneously present.
And timeless.
Timeless, yes.
They are very expensive, Michelangelo.
But you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
For me, Michelangelo has been a very important mentor. Yeah. I almost get a tear always when I even think of him. He was so great.
And you see Michelangelo with the eyes or your peripheric vision?
I sense it through my body and my muscles, and that's what Michelangelo writes, that no artist or architect can succeed without being an expert on the human body. I mean, drawing and understanding it, and you sense it. His lines do not address your eye; they address your veins and your muscles. There is an interesting theory that the Greek sculpture achieved perfection in depicting the human body 1,000 years before the same happened in painting, which is a mystery. Why would that be the case? And the suggestion is that Greek sculpture was not a visual art, it was communication from the muscles of the sculptor directly to the muscles of the observer. And I have very strong feeling that there is a truth in that.
And this is very Finnish in a way. forest and bodies.
Yes.
Very, very, very interesting. Shall I proceed? And I must confess, a surprise, because it was what we have decided to discuss 2 years ago, and I wish to come back to it, if you don't mind. So we are now in a very special place with several layers of time or history, which is Granada in Alhambra. And we are very keen, and I'm very happy that Chopina is here with Brigitte Fleck, Saravá, because this is one of the most touching places, sites in the world, I believe, I think. I was very touched when I was there. I was quite little. And we know that there's, in my point of view, a fantastic project which is dealing exactly, in my point of view, with this connection between north and south, the idea of the courtyard, the patio, these fragments, the organization of the land, the topographic, how to organize the path, the percurso, which is something that Álvaro is a genius to, you know.
It's one.
It's one, okay. One of, okay. Don't allow us to make him okay. But do you know this project, and how can we see an architect from the 21st century, Álvaro Siza, working in one more layer after, let's say, the North African and the Arab situation. After all, let's come back, the time of Carlos V, Charles V, you see this pure Renaissance
Studied in Italy.
Yes, it's absolutely incredible. And then now this project, a contemporary project made in a sequence with all these layers of history. I would like to ask Álvaro if you could explain us a little bit of this incredible challenge. This is a very strong affair.
We began, I made this competition with a Spanish architect, young architect, Juan Domingo Santos, and that lives in Granada. So we could, I knew already Alhambra, I had been a number of times, but he put me in contact with people that really knew everything, even read I didn't know the decoration, those decorations in Alhambra are poems, written poems. And I knew a historian there that could read and explain me. In one patio was a poem about the beauty of that space. Then poems about love, and so and those are decorations. So the beginning of the project, we were between the attraction of the delicate architecture, Arab architecture, the palace, so delicate, so worked, full of decoration and so, and the palace of Charles V. The contrast between that delicate sequence of palaces and the so strong this. And then I myself, I was between attraction to try the delicate ambience of the palaces. And at the same time, saying, no, this is crazy. We cannot make something similar to this or coming from this directly. So I have Charles V, the architect there, I don't remember now the name, Spanish, that worked seams with Michelangelo. He arrived there and put that brutal volume. Anyway, today it's impossible to think of Alhambra without the palace. If I imagine to take the Charles V palace, Alhambra disappears, fragmented. And I was in this thing to be more affirmative in architecture or more respectful of the Arab. Then I realized that Charles V worked so well, even with such a contradiction, because its appearance, its conception, comes not only from a talented architect, but a real change of power and all the support and wish related with that political change. And then I thought this way is not for me because I don't have the Isabella Catholic with this woman that got to expose the Jews, to expose the Arabs, and to introduce Inquisition. Then such a force had to give something coherent, consistent, even in tremendous contradiction. Then I follow another way, not so affirmative, not so delicate, but the way I found to work was the fact that 8,500 arrived there each day, all the year, and it's very uncomfortable and they have to do something. Then I thought about this parcours, and where were coming the bus, where come the taxi, the private motor cars, the topography, how to work in this topography to enter with comfort, and that was it. And then I won the competition, and then it's gone. So better not to speak more about Alhambra.
You think? No, but we are organizing an excursion now to Alhambra. Do you want to come with us?
Yes, I will. For me, Alhambra is one of the great miracles of architecture, and all great pieces of architecture and art, they are miracles. It's just impossible to understand how such perfect things come about in the messy human, quarreling human world. And I congratulate for the courage of building something next to the miracle of Alhambra.
That's why it must be built.
Yes.
No, it's completely. Okay, an organization was created, an organization called SOS Alhambra. And the president is, as I could imagine, an architect. And it passes also by Docomomo.
Não, Icomos.
Icomono. I see.
Não.
Oh, yes.
Sempre enganar-se. Eu Icomos.
Okay, better to come back to Alvar Aalto.
This is our thing. Now, let's come to architecture. And I think Alhambra is fantastic. And I would like to have your, if you agree, and this is some quotations from Juhani Pallasmaa. You say that a wise architect works with his or her entire body and sense of self. And the entire bodily and mental constitution of the maker becomes the site of the work. Somehow, I believe we can find this way of work, this kind of plenitude, I'm speaking to you both, this way of putting all you are into the smallest thing you do. This is I'm quoting Ricardo Reis, one of the Fernando Pessoa, our poet heteronym. So he says that putting all you are into the smallest thing you do. Can we see this in the most vernacular Mediterranean culture? And perhaps the vernacular, it's classic too. I would like to know if you agree.
Yes,
that you put yourself in the entire.
Well, I'm initially a farm boy. I grew up during the war years at my farmer grandfather's tiny farmhouse in central Finland. And I have learned later on to respect the farm life where everyone knew everything that was needed to do for survival. I never heard anyone in the farm community ask another one, can you do this? It was assumed that everyone can do everything that is needed. And this is the kind of internalized life where knowledge and skills are not external to you, they are part of your being. And I can show you my fingers full of scars because my grandfather gave me my first sharp knife at the age of 5. And I learned to use the knife, but I can see the marks in my fingers. That's the kind of internalization of work that I find so important. Today, architects' work is too much seen as an intellectualized, work. A great artist always works on himself at least as much as on the work. This is what Wittgenstein says in one of his notes. Philosophy and architecture are similar. They are both ways of working on yourself. And I, as a teacher, I always try to emphasize this aspect of working on yourself. I think it's the primary perspective. The building or painting or what poem is a consequence of that, sincere, hard work on yourself.
Siza, do you want to comment?
No, I agree completely. But I did not begin working
with knives.
I did not.
But that's the difference between cultures. In the forest culture, everyone used to have this knife because you needed it at every turn of the day, to do this or that.
Zumthor, for instance, began as working carpentry.
Yes, that's right, yes.
And there are others. But I was too urban. Anyway, what I found also very important in this, we spoke Aalto, Corbusier, Neutra, and the others. But as we spoke of these three, is when they built a house or projected a house, in the beginning, I think they made the house for themselves, as they thought of the things they themselves needed at home, and then of course spoke with the owner and so something changed. But what impressed me, for instance, Neutra House I visited in Los Angeles, in a hill.
Yes.
He designed with same engagement and concentration cabinets, armários é cabinetes, não? Que se diz armário, armoire.
Yes, cabinet.
I don't know.
Places to store it.
Cabinets for
Yes, cupboard.
where put this,
Yes.
where put the material to clean this, where put the keys. Everything is designed in the right place, very well, as perfect as the main door, imagine, and place for everything. And the same I saw in the apartment of Corbusier in Paris. It's amazing. He cared of everything, practical things in the house, and everything was beautiful drawing, but not an imposing detail. Beautiful drawing, he will and touch and so on, but not.
You are making a very important point here that the great architects, they pay attention to the practicalities and details of life. They really design choreography of life rather than a building. Then it turns into a fine building also. But
when we think that today, practically, as to myself it happens, and I think for everybody, I'm finishing one house, and then I must stop because comes a decorator. And in a moment where so many hotels are being built in Porto and Lisbon, amounts of small hotels, there is, I would say that there is not one designed by an architect and his team, of course, that can include people more specialized in interiors, in the team maybe, but it's a team, it's the same project, it's different from go, now comes decorator, which now is called interiorist. There is a colleague that commenting this, one from Lisbon, Carrillo, I think, that for us, architects, it remains only the skin. But it's already a skin without eyes, because the interior makes an interiorist without dialogue. The space around is made by a landscape architect, or maybe if there are complex windows and so, maybe a specialist of the facades, window facades. So it is all broken. And then the attraction I felt when I saw the Neutra house or Corbusier apartment is made for people. It is for himself, but shortly is made for people with their needs, and then is introduced the wishes, but the needs. So
I think that's an important point that you can only design seriously and deeply for yourself. You cannot design authentically for the other. You have to become the other, and then in the end of the process you donate end product to the user or client, but it has to go through your personal identification.
Even if you are designing an hospital or a school Let's think about Paimio, for instance.
Yes, I
was
think
so
so.
innovative in the
Absolutely.
20s.
Absolutely, because every building constitutes of human situations, and the architect has to internalize those human situations, and it can only happen through herself or himself, you know. Like Alvar Aalto explains that when he started to design the Paimio Sanatorium, he was ill himself. And then he realized almost naively that an ill person is in a horizontal position. And he started to design the sanatorium for the horizontal man, as he said. That's a almost childish realization, but so fundamental.
Maison Carrée, I think it's one of the last of Aalto, no? In Paris, the one in Paris.
Well, it's the late 50s.
Maison Carrée. Yeah. And we visited. Now it's possible to visit. It was bought by the Finnish government or
yes,
so.
yes.
But it's open to public.
How he cared of the knocks, all the knocks. They are different according to the site where they are placed. The one thing I remember is, como é que se diz corrimão? The
Handrail.
and the drave.
Handrail.
The way he made the end of the handrail, I don't remember what he did, some curve or so. Then you go down, you feel it's finished. You don't fall down because also the places for everything. It's armario, cupboard
It's
in
fantastic,
the rooms.
the one in Maison Carrée.
It's a world. There are things for everything on top. Incredible.
I think we arrived to an interesting point, and then I believe we must stop because it's time to. But it's something that it's now quite in a dangerous situation. It's the condition of architecture, and an architect has someone who has a round knowledge. I believe you have some convictions on this matter. So concerning specialization or not specialization, how do you see the future of our office, our mission as architects?
I'm very irritated by words specialist and expert. I just shiver when I hear those, you know, when on television someone is interviewed as an expert. What is that? Joseph Brodsky, the poet, for instance, he was also opposed to expertise. He writes, for instance, that a craftsman does not collect expertise, but uncertainties. I think it's a beautiful statement, and at least in my life, I'm collecting uncertainties rather than expertise. And when I was a young architect, I knew what a window was and what a door was. Now I don't anymore. I have to invent them, reinvent them always.
And concerning the education of architects, do you have any suggestion outside?
I think the education of architects almost everywhere in the world goes 100% to the wrong direction. Exactly, training experts who have ready-made answers to everything. In architecture, there are no ready-made answers, just as in life. They are all, special situations which have to be confronted at that moment and at that place. Now, in my view, the university education in architecture is not anymore the place for distributing information. Information is something that has very little value. Education, university education needs to train wisdom. They have to, somehow spread wisdom. But that happens in so few schools nowadays. And then, of course, the tendency towards total computerization of the profession is also, in my view, absolutely wrong. We should go back to the, practice of making, because through making you get completely different ideas than through electronic devices. So I would say 100% turn around in architectural education.
Now is coming, or is already proved, I'm not sure, in Portugal, a comic thing, is that there will be, is proposed and probably approved, an obligation of a team to be contracted for public work or so, is obliged to have a specialist of coordination engineer. This is coming or is approved already. Or the point is that if it is a specialty, it cannot coordinate by nature, by his nature.
Isn't architecture itself the art of coordination?
But it's worst in some countries in Europe in general than in Portugal. The problem is Portugal usually is inspired about what is going on in France. France is the worst country where to make architecture. It's the worst in the world. No, it's absolutely impossible. I made a project there, and when began the construction, received a letter saying of the director of the work contracted by the owner, what we want is your talent, but forget that idea of designing the windows, and that and that and that. Leave that to specialists. Not like this, exactly. I'm not. And I wrote to the bishop saying, if this is my interlocutor, I go.
I also made a project in Paris opposite the Sorbonne, and I have never had so much trouble as with that one.
Where?
In Paris, opposite the Sorbonne. Everything had to be done twice. They had to be first make things wrong, and then after a lot of fighting, they did it fairly correctly, but only on the second try.
But not to begin with the pessimist.
No, not at all. No, let's look to Alhambra, which is fantastic.
Say something about Alhambra.
And making our excursion. No.
Say something beautiful.
No, we must finish, I think. And I think it will be nice to have the chance if have any contribution from the public. But first, I have a question, namely for Juhani Pallasmaa. I know that after we arranged this dialogue in 2014, I think, you had, so Siza and Pallasmaa, the chance to be together in Madrid in a kind of dialogue too. But as far as I know, Moneo and what was the other one?
Eduardo Soto de Moura.
Okay, they spoke a lot.
We were four.
I try to don't speak too much, although I'm new to be too much bavard. Do you want to say anything that we had not chance to talk about to Siza? Or
No,
So now I disappear.
thousands of things, but
Okay, but later on. Okay. So I think it's the moment to see if there's any question, any comment. No, Brigitte? Nothing? Brigitte Fleck, she wrote in the first, as a first critic in the positive way of Siza in the 70s. And we are very grateful that you came. So, there's any question? Well, I came from South America and they have always lots of questions. It's a different public. Okay. So, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming to Álvaro, Siza, Juhani, Pallasmaa. Thank you so much.